Thanks everybody for joining. Before we dive into the content today, just wanted to highlight a couple of upcoming Airflow community events and content that has come out recently. A couple of Airflow meetups are happening later in May and in June. So if you happen to be in London or Charlotte, definitely consider going to those. Those are always really fun events. There's also going to be a virtual Data Galaxy Tech Summit at the end of this month. I'll actually be speaking there on using Airflow and Databricks. I'm going to throw the link to that registration in the chat in case anybody's interested. Raj already threw a link into the Airflow Slack. Definitely join there if you haven't already. It's a great way to interact with the community. And lastly, I'll say if you're interested in talking about your Airflow use and any use cases that you have worked on and want to publish those on the Airflow medium, definitely reach out to us. We'd be happy to work with you on that and help you get published. Other thing I'll mention today is the Airflow Summit is happening in September. It's going to be in person this year in Toronto. We're super, super excited about that. Viraj and I will both be there, and we would love to see you there as well. I should have updated this slide. I think the CFP is now closed, but we would love for you to get tickets so you can come to the event. I'm sure Viraj can throw the link to that in the chat. So we hope to see you there. There'll be lots of great Airflow content from astronomer and companies all over the world. Cool. So with that, I think time to jump into the actual content for today. We're going to be talking about what's new in Airflow 2.6. These new Airflow release webinars are some of my favorite ones to do. The Airflow project is moving really quickly and there's lots of great stuff and all the new releases, this one included. So we're going to go through all of that. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before I get started. I mentioned before this is being recorded and you will receive an email with a link to the recording afterwards. Usually those come within a day or two after we finish the event, so you will be able to rewatch, no worries on that. We'll also send you out a link to a repo that has all of the code that I'm going to cover, so you can actually play around with these example DAGs highlighting what's new in 2.6. Please ask questions. You can throw those in the Q&A or in the chat. Just make sure to change your chat to everyone so everyone can see those. Viraj will be answering as we go through, and then there will also be time for open Q&A at the end here. So definitely don't hold back. We'd love to see those kind of as we're going through. And with that, we'll go ahead and kick it off. So obviously, I'm assuming that most people here are at least familiar with Airflow or have already used it a little bit, but always just like to highlight kind of the breadth of the Airflow project and how fast it's moving and how big it is. Airflow has a super strong open source community, which is part of what allows it to move really quickly. And so we get these new releases all the time. There are over 2,000 contributors, so people helping to make releases like the 2.6 one really successful and include lots of great new features. So all of that contributes to the strength of the project. And yeah, we're really excited about where it's going. Airflow releases. So if this is your first time coming to one of our Airflow release webinars, we actually do these pretty frequently. The Airflow 2.6 was released at the very end of April, so just a couple of weeks ago, and included some great new features that we're going to go through today. Obviously, if you're on an older version of Airflow, there are many, many reasons to upgrade. Just in the last year, I guess, we've had at least 4 minor releases now, and those have included huge new features that really change the game with what you can do with Airflow. So included things like data overscheduling, dynamic task mapping, task annotations, DAG.test command, lots and lots of great stuff. So this is a great reason to keep your Airflow up to date and take advantage of everything. So today, we're just going to focus on what's new in this 2.6 release. There is lots of great stuff in there that kind of encompasses almost every use case. So I'm going to go through, I won't have a chance to go through every single thing that was in there because there were over 35 new features and over 50 improvements, as well as a whole bunch of bug fixes. So that's obviously a lot to talk through, but we'll kind of highlight the most important stuff, at least from our opinion, working with lots of Airflow people who use Airflow in production. And we'll also throw a link to the release notes, so make sure that you can see everything. We have lots of resources on kind of the bigger new features in 2.6, so we'll include some of those as well. So what I'm going to do here is go through some of the bigger updates in the slides just to give you a sense of what was in this release and kind of talk through some of these new features. And then I'll move into a demo and actually show some of them so you get a sense of how they're implemented. And again, that repo will be sent out afterwards so you can play around with it. And then we'll go through some of the things that we don't demo at the end, just other things to be aware of. So diving right in, first new feature that I'll cover was net new in 2.6. So this did not exist before. They're called notifiers. Notifiers are an easy and extensible way to add notifications to your DAGs. So you may be familiar with the on callback function. So these are like on success callback or on failure callback, things like that, that you can set either at the DAG or task level that will run some sort of function based on whatever that callback is doing. So if it's on success, it'll do it when your task succeeds, things like that. The difference with notifiers is that they really turn this into their own class. So they're, again, more extensible, they're easier to use. You don't necessarily have to just write your own function for whatever the callback is. And really importantly, they open the door for including kind of pre-built notifiers within Airflow. So one that was released in 2.6 was the Slack notifier. So probably tons of people here use Slack notifications for their DAGs. That's one of the most common notifications we see. It used to be before this, you had to kind of write your own function to do that. And there's lots of examples out there. It's not super complicated, but just an extra lift for you. So now this is pre-built in. It's going to be part of the Slack provider. And I'll show how you can use this in a little bit. But in general, this is, again, going to open the door for anybody who works on providers or the community to contribute notifiers back. So they'll be part of those provider packages, or you can always create your own, and we'll show how to do that too. And those are going to be, if you do create your own, they're going to be reusable across all of the DAGs within your Airflow environment. So you don't have to kind of worry about, how to import those functions and things like that. So super cool there on the, alerting and observability aspect of Airflow. The next big update is there's a new continuous timetable. So if anybody has used sensors before or has dealt with needing a DAG to run all the time, this is super common. That's why we pulled this little snippet from a GitHub issue on how to make the S3 key sensor run. You can see it was viewed 27,000 times over 4 years. So this is obviously a really common request in Airflow. This is a timetable that was added that is going to allow you to do that. So it's just like what it sounds. It's at continuous, and it's going to make a new DAG runs be scheduled as soon as the prior run is finished. The benefit to using this is if you do have something that, a DAG that you want to wait for something to happen, like with a sensor, and you just want it to be waiting all the time, this is a great way to implement that. I will note that this is not for streaming. So if you are working with a streaming use case, you're still going to want to use a tool like Kafka. You can use that in combination with Airflow. We have a lot of resources on how you might do that, but that's not what this timetable was built for. Again, it was meant for if you just kind of want to have that one DAG running all the time. So we'll show some examples of this, but that definitely has already, we've seen, made some people's lives easier instead of trying to do like an every minute schedule and manage kind of your DAG runs with a lot of different parameters. This makes that a lot more straightforward. Next, there were some great CLI updates. So if anybody uses the Airflow CLI, or actually if you use the Astro CLI as well, you can run these commands. These are going to be helpful for getting information about your DAG runs or your connections. So I've listed these. Airflow DAG details and Airflow config list are just going to give you information about either the DAG you ask about or the config section that you provide. So that's a great way to just see what's going on within the Airflow environment if you prefer to interact with Airflow via the CLI as opposed to the UI. So those are super helpful. The other one here that is really, really awesome, I'm super excited about this, is the Airflow connections test command. This is a great way of testing your Airflow connection without having to actually run the DAG and like make your task fail. So once you've defined a connection in your Airflow environment, you can simply test it using the CLI, and it's going to spit out either it was a success or it failed and what the issue was. Connections are super tricky in Airflow. Debugging them is one of the biggest parts of debugging DAGs often if you're connecting to external systems. And this is, again, just another tool in your toolbox, especially if you prefer working locally within the CLI as opposed to going to the UI to test connections that way. So excited about that update there. There were also a couple of new asynchronous hooks or operators added in 2.6. So if you're not familiar, async operators, or also known as deferrable operators, are a type of operator that are going to release their worker slot. They hand that over to a process called the triggerer, which has to also be running. These were released in Airflow 2.2. The main benefit of using deferrable operators is that they're more scalable. So because they release that worker slot, you have more room in your Airflow instance to run other tasks, particularly useful for long-running tasks. They can also save you money because the process that the trigger runs does a lot of combining of those asynchronous processes. So if you have a lot of different operators that are waiting for jobs to run, say in Databricks or some other system, or you have a query that takes a long time, it's going to be a lot more efficient to run all of those within the trigger than it is to run, your worker slots for each task. So those can, especially if you're at a high scale, can save you a lot of money. Again, that was a super great feature that was released in Airflow 2.2. If you haven't used it already, these are super easy to implement. They are designed to be interchangeable with their non-deferrable counterparts. So you can just plug in the new operator name. You just have to have that trigger running, which if you're running like using the Astro CLI locally, which is open source, you'll already have one running. So you can try things out that way. Since that feature was released, there's been a pretty steady stream of additions to of new asynchronous hooks and operators just to expand that functionality into the project. And the 2.6 release was no exception here. So the two most notable ones that were included in this release are the HTTP hook. So that's super great if you're doing a lot of API calls, especially if you've implemented them in your own Python functions and you're using that hook instead of the operator. You can make use of that. Also, the trigger DAG run operator is now async. So that's super helpful, especially in the case where you set it up to wait for the other DAG to finish, if it's happening in the middle of your DAG. And maybe that other DAG is going to take a long time. It's great to be able to release that worker slot. This one works a little differently than a lot of the other async ones. So I'm actually going to show how this works in the demo, but those are two that people, definitely want to take advantage of. And this is one that I'm not actually going to demo, but I think one of the most notable things that happened in 2.6, just from an Airflow quality of life perspective, if you've used Airflow for any amount of time, certainly if you've used Airflow for as long as I have, which I won't date myself, but pre-2.0 days, many years ago, you've probably dealt with tasks getting stuck in a queued state. This is a really common issue, in all orchestrators like Airflow included, and it can be really difficult to debug and fix. But Airflow has made had a couple of releases that made a lot of progress on this, and then in 2.6 did a big update to consolidate a lot of the logic for stuck tasks, which will basically mean that you won't ever have tasks stuck in queued. So one of the previous challenges with this is that there were configurations that you could set for how long something would run before it timed out. So these configurations that have been deprecated listed here below, things like the worker pods pending timeout if you're using Kubernetes executor or things like that, that would say like, okay, once this time period has reached, let's kill this task so it doesn't just sit in queued forever. One of the challenges with these is that if none of them happened to apply, if none of them was the reason why your task got stuck in queued, it would just sit in queued forever. So trying to, account for all of those different issues that could be occurring was challenging. Now that's all been consolidated into this new config parameter that's called task queued timeout. This is something you can control, so it's going to default to 600 seconds, but you can update this for your Airflow instance. Once that timeout has been reached, any task is going to be either retried or marked as failed, depending on how you have your settings applied for that particular task. So regardless of what is causing it to be stuck in queued, it will no longer get stuck past that 600-second mark. So this is huge. It, again, is going to really pull a lot of that troubleshooting into more automated processes, which is what you want when you're running Airflow in production. You don't want to have to go in there manually and figure out why your task isn't running just to see it stuck in queued. So this will allow all of the logic that you have set around retries and what you want your task to do if an issue is hit to actually be automated, and you won't have to deal with this problem anymore. So this is a really great way, or a really great reason, I should say, to upgrade Airflow. So as somebody said in the chat, you don't have to debug those gray boxes. I feel like everybody's least favorite thing to do. Won't go through this too much on the slide, but there were lots of UI updates. I'm actually going to show these, which will be a better experience than my slightly blurry GIF here. But UI updates were one of the biggest things in Airflow 2.6. There's lots of cool stuff in there that we are actually just going to go through. So with that, I'm going to hop over to my Airflow environment and walk through some of these features. Just a note, I'm running Airflow just locally on my computer here. I'm using the Astro CLI. This is open source. It's available for everybody to use. It's running our Astro runtime 8.0, which uses Airflow 2.6. We do have Astro runtime will get same day release support. So anytime a new Airflow release comes out, if you want to play around with it, you can use the Astro CLI the same day and get access to that locally. So if you are running an older version of Airflow in production and you want to try out 2.6, this is a great way to do that. Cool. So going through, the first thing I'll note is some of the UI changes. So since we were just there, I'm going to go to this UI features tag. The biggest change here in the UI in 2.6 was a big update to the grid view, which is super helpful for seeing the history of all of your task runs. So you have information about your task instances here. But previously you had to hop over to the graph view if you wanted to actually see what was going on in your DAG. And in this one, it's a bit complicated. Now within the grid view, you actually have a graph built in. So we still have our task details here, or DAG run details, depending on what we're highlighted. But if you hop over to this graph view, you get the full graph of your DAG built in right here. So you don't have to switch to another view. The other great thing about this is it highlights automatically based on what you have selected from the grid. So if I want to look at, say, this task group 1, if I click on this task instance, it's going to highlight where that is in my DAG, as well as everything that's upstream and downstream. If I expand this, it will expand the task group in the grid. Same with collapsing. I can go up and down here. I can click on this other task group and expand that one. You also have this filter tasks button. This is new, so I can filter this graph view and the grid as well, upstream, downstream, or both. So if I do both, I see only the task or task group that I have selected and the tasks upstream and downstream. And then I can go ahead and clear this if I want to reset back. You'll also notice down here we have a little mini map showing where I am in the graph overall. So this is super, super helpful if you have very complex DAGs. Obviously, if you just have a couple of tasks, it's not that hard to view a graph. But if you have something like this, or, you know, we work with people who have thousands of tasks in a single DAG, it's obviously a little bit hard to navigate. This can help a lot just to see where you are and be able to kind of drill down into certain parts of your DAG specifically and see what's going on. So really great usability update there. Okay, next I will go through the continuous timetable. So again, the purpose of this is to schedule a DAG so that it is always running a single DAG run. If I go ahead and turn this DAG on, triggering it, maybe I shouldn't have triggered it manually. It's going to do 2 here because I hit the manual trigger to turn it on. But what this is going to do is you're going to see this DAG run. It's going to sleep for some random period of time before it succeeds. And now that it has, we should see another run start. There goes my manual run. here. So in order to implement this, all you have to do is provide this @continuous timetable to your schedule parameter. Again, this is built into Airflow, so it's you don't have to like install the timetable separately or anything like that. The other thing that you do have to do here is set max active runs equal to 1 for your DAG. If you don't do this, you will get an import error. It will not let you do that. Obviously, that could cause some huge issues if you tried to schedule things on top of each other over and over again. So you will have to set that parameter. So again, this is meant to be running a single DAG run just once constantly. If we go back to the grid, you can see it's just going to keep going. So as soon as one finishes, another one starts. Again, this is super helpful if you have use cases where you're implementing a sensor and you're waiting for something to happen, but you want to be always waiting. So say I want to run my DAG every time a file lands in S3, but I don't want to try and deal with like, I don't know how long that's going to take, and I need that DAG run to finish before another one starts. You can use this timetable for that. Just as an example of that, if we look at this continuous S3 DAG, and again, you'll get all of the code for this after. This is going to be a little bit more of a realistic example here where I'm using this S3 key sensor async to, again, wait for a file to land in a specific bucket before going on and copying some objects around to a different bucket and deleting them. So actually lots of great features shown here in this DAG, including dynamic task mapping, but this is all going to be scheduled on that continuous so that I'm just waiting. Anytime something drops in my bucket, my DAG's going to kick off and process it. So yeah, great example of that there. All right, moving right along. Next, we'll talk through the notifiers example. So a couple of things to show here. Again, notifiers are going to send a notification. That's how they're intended, but they're going to provide more extensibility there. If we look at the code in this example, there's a couple of things I want to show here. You can obviously create your own notifier. So right now, the Slack notifier is the only one that has been contributed to core Airflow. I think this will expand quite a lot in the next couple of versions as more community members contribute them. And I'll say, like, if you have a notification that you would like to add to a provider package, please do. Like, community contributions are usually the most helpful for things like that there. But in general, what you're going to do is just create your notifier class, define what it's going to do. This one's just going to create a file locally, and then you can use this at your either at the DAG level or at the task level. So these are going to do a couple different things. So on failure callback or on success callback at the DAG level, parameters are going to run based on the state of your DAG run, so whether the whole DAG succeeds or fails, so you can use a notifier in either of those. You can also use them at the task level. So our default args here are going to pass that notifier for each task, whether it fails or whether it succeeds. And then you can obviously override that on each individual task. So lots of options here on what happens if we, just to give you a sense of how this actually works, if I trigger this DAG, we have 2 of these tasks that are going to succeed and 2 of them are going to fail. If I hop over to my code editor here, you'll see that these files were written. This is our notifier in this case, it's just writing a file to our include directory. So you can see how that works. For other custom ones, to look at a bit of more complicated example, you probably won't want to define the notifier actually in your DAG file because you might want to use it across all of your DAGs. So in general, if you're going to define your own, you just need to create a class like this my S3 notifier. It's going to inherit from this base notifier, which was the big class added in Airflow 2.6. And then you can define whatever you want this notifier to do. So this one is going to write some files to S3 based on what happens, but you can define the fields that you want to template and pass in. And then you define this notify function. So again, in this case, we are going through and uploading a file, creating a file and uploading it to S3. Yours might do whatever you want to notify based on what is happening in your DAGs. Then if we're going to use this, if you are creating your own, I would recommend putting it in your include directory like this, so it can be used across all your DAGs. And then if we go to our notifier S3 DAG, you can see here that we're going to import it at the top. So from include, import my S3 notifier, and then you can use it in your DAG params. So here's our on failure callback. If something fails, we're going to pass in this information to the file that we write to S3. If something succeeds, we're going to pass in different information. If you just want to use the Slack notifier, so if you do Slack notifications, those are always my favorite. We have an example of that in here as well. Again, this one's going to be included in the Slack provider, so make sure that that's installed in your Airflow environment. But then you can just import it and then use it in your DAG, and that's it. Super straightforward. So much easier than previous Slack notification setup. And again, we'll expect more functionality to be added here, especially for the providers for services that typically are used for logging, monitoring, alerting, and things like that. All right, let's go back to our Airflow UI. So that was our notifiers. A couple of other things that I will highlight here that I didn't put in the slides that were cool new features within Airflow 2.6. One of them was triggering DAG ones with parameters. So this was a great UI feature that was added. So if we take a look at the code for this DAG, if you have any DAGs where you they are parameterized so that you pass information in at runtime, oftentimes this will be done automatically by whatever your process is. But in this case, so we have a couple of DAG params. We have dog name, the number of treats, and whether the dog is happy pre-treats. I'm going to say the answer to that in my case is probably no, but your mileage may vary. So something like this, where you have params set up. Now, if you go to trigger your DAG with config, previously you would have to just fill in a blank box what your parameters were. Now you have this really nice form you can fill out that actually has all of the parameters. It's going to be pre-filled with the default. So I can change this for my case. I'm going to give him, he's been a good boy today, so we'll give him 10 treats and we'll say he was already happy. So I can go ahead and trigger that. In the grid view, we'll see this is running. That's going to print out some information in the logs. But again, that's just a lot easier so that you have a better UI experience. You don't have to figure out like what the parameters were. The UI form is just going to tell you. The other great thing about this is if I go and trigger this again, now all of your recent configurations are stored within Airflow. So you can see here I have the default parameters, but I can also select recent runs so that if you want to just rerun with the parameters that you already have, you can just select that here and change. So again, mostly a convenience thing. This is going to be most relevant probably for manual DAG runs, but super nice, especially if you're doing a lot of testing with any parameterized DAGs there. Okay, hopping back. I said there was lots of great little stuff within Airflow 2.6, so we're going to keep motoring on. Next one is XCOM serialization. So if you're familiar, if you ever use XCOMs, you have to have the value that you are returning be JSON serializable. Otherwise, you will get a failure. This is relevant if you're developing an operator that's going to return a value, or certainly if you're writing your own Python functions and you're using XCOM to pass information between them. Now within Airflow 2.6, Pandas data frames will automatically be serialized for you. So you can always create your own XCOM backend that has custom serialization and deserialization methods. That was really common to do that for things like Pandas if you're working with data frames a lot. But this particular one is just built in now. So to give you a sense of what that looks like, rather than doing something custom, you can set up a task that returns a data frame. So in prior versions of Airflow, this would fail because it's not JSON serializable, but now it's going to do that for you. And then obviously you can pull that in a downstream task This is using task flow, but you can do this with traditional operators as well. To give you a sense of what that looks like in the logs, I just ran this earlier. And if we go ahead and come over here, oops, clicked on the wrong task. It's the push one. You can see that your pandas data frame and all of its information was passed to XCOM. So again, super convenient, especially if you work with data frames a lot. Alrighty, next that I want to cover is max active TIs per DAG run. So this was is a new param that was added at the task level, particularly relevant for dynamic task mapping. So if we turn this on and run this DAG, we'll see that this DAG is going to create some number of parallel tasks copied. Presuming it gets out of schedule, but we'll give that a minute. In any case, if you are using dynamic task mapping, one of the benefits there is that you can create a copy of your task at runtime, and you don't have to know ahead of time how many tasks there are going to be. It's going to be dynamic every time. One of the potential issues with this is that depending on where you're getting the information that you're mapping over, you have to be pretty careful about how you control the scale. So if you're looking at something that might all of a sudden return like thousands of tasks, you're going to want to make sure that your Airflow environment is set up to handle that. This param is just a way to control that so that you don't end up with a whole bunch of tasks running at the same time, or at least you can control how many are running. So previously you would only be able to set the number of tasks running in a whole DAG. Now you can do it just within that task, and you can do it in a mapped task like this. So super easy to implement. And yeah, very helpful there if you utilize dynamic task mapping a lot. Okay, I think that was everything that I wanted to show in the UI for now. So I'm going to hop back over to my slides here. Couple other updates that I just want to highlight and talk through so that you're aware of them. Because again, there was so much in this release, we can't go through everything today. Some of these I actually did cover. So again, max active TIs per DAG run, great param for dynamically mapped tasks. Definitely recommend using that as a safeguard. One huge update that I didn't show, but that is going to be really big if you're working with deferrable operators or async operators, like I talked about before, is that the logs for those from the trigger are now in line with your task logs in the UI. So it used to be that all of your logs, when that task got deferred to the trigger, all of those logs would have to be retrieved from the trigger, which could be kind of tricky if you didn't have your Airflow instance set up to send those somewhere. Now they're just going to be in your task log. So that makes debugging a whole lot easier if you're using asynchronous operators, especially if you're doing something like creating a new one, which definitely do and contribute it back to the Airflow project. That will be a lot easier now. We went over save and restore recent DAG run configs. That was, again, that parameterized example, super helpful there. The external task sensor got a new param for skipped states. So again, just if you use external task sensor as a way of creating, event-driven DAGs or connecting cross-DAG dependencies, you have additional options for how you want that to schedule now. So that's great. For task retries, there's a new max task retry delay param. So if you use exponential backoff, which means as you retry each time, it will wait longer and longer before retrying. Super helpful if you connect to external systems that you think may be down at certain times, so that your task will just wait a while. You now have, again, more control over that so that you can set a maximum so that you don't just wait progressively forever. We went over serialization of pandas data frames. Oh, and I have this one twice. I'm so excited about saving and restoring DAG run configs that I listed it here. So that's super cool. Definitely take advantage of that. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is some improvements. So these are things that you don't really see as you're using Airflow. You're not really going to interact with as a DAG author, but just make Airflow more speedy, more performant, more usable. And more stable and secure. So this is another great reason for upgrading. Obviously, the new features are always really exciting. Everybody wants to take advantage of those. But a lot of the work that goes into an Airflow upgrade is also just kind of the nitty-gritty of making things work better, which is going to mean you get a better experience overall, especially as you are using Airflow in production. But again, things that you might not see. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those from this 2.6 release because there was a lot of great stuff, especially around the speed and performance, things like how Airflow imports are preloaded, how nested task groups are loaded and cached, how the CLI works, and especially around user role and management. All of those things got significant speed ups, so that's great. Also use SLA callbacks. They changed how these were managed, and they're also a lot more performant now, so that's great. And again, some asynchronous updates, as much as you might use asynchronous hooks and operators and things like that, there are also a lot of Airflow processes under the hood that take advantage of that. So now that the trigger exists and you can use that async technology, they're moving more and more of those processes into being asynchronous, which again just helps Airflow perform better, be more stable. A couple of just usability things to note that will be relevant if you use these things, maybe not if you don't, but could be super helpful. For K8's executor or Kubernetes pod operator, you can now have longer pod names. That was a little issue that we had heard, periodically, people trying to, especially DevOps teams, trying to have standardized pod names would come up across that limit. So that was increased. If you use task notes a lot, so adding notes to your task instances or DAG runs in the UI, you can now do those in Markdown, which also means you can add them in Markdown in your DAG file and they'll be rendered as task notes. So super helpful for documentation there. Also, the CLI commands have more colors for help outputs now. So if you prefer to work from your terminal and using the CLI rather than the UI, that's just going to be a little easier to use. So everybody likes that. Definitely recommend checking out all of the 2.6 release notes. Again, there's a lot of stuff that we didn't have time to cover today, but may be very relevant to you depending on your Airflow use case. I will throw a link to the notes in the chat, or Viraj can, so that you can check all of those out and get access to all of the great updates. And with that, we wanted to leave about 15 minutes to cover any questions that Viraj hasn't already answered.
Awesome. That was great, Kenton. The questions were coming in fast and furious. I think I got to most of them. I think one thing that might be helpful to, if you were to double click on, is like, what's the difference between, so with notifiers, right? A lot of people have asked, like, how is this different than what you could do before with just the callbacks? Can you just go over that one more time?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say there's not like a technical difference in that there's nothing, it's not like, oh, you couldn't do this before and now you can. With a notifier, the biggest change is kind of how pluggable those functions are. So before, if you were going to define like a custom function, you could do that and you could import it, from somewhere else in your environment. That's not that different. The biggest thing here is, again, that they're going to be just a little bit more standardized. So you have access to them across your Airflow environment, and it's easier. You have a framework from which to build them so that you're not writing code just from scratch yourself. And I think the biggest thing is probably that it makes it easier to make contributions to the provider packages. So having things like the Slack notifier that's already pre-built, before there was just, you could write your own function using the Slack provider, but there wasn't something standardized. Now that's just packaged within that provider, and it's a lot easier to do that now. So I would say if you're going to write, a new function and you're still doing something custom, I would recommend using the notifiers again, because a lot of the scaffolding is there, instead of just writing your own function. But if you were writing something that didn't include like sending a notification, that's kind of how they're set up. You can still just write a custom callback function. Hopefully that helps.
That helped a ton. Let's see if there's any other questions here. So for folks asking about the slides and accessing past webinars, all the slides and code will be sent out to you, as well as I'll drop a link in the chat where you can see some of our past webinars, in case you want to rewatch things. Mike, your question about cluster policies, we don't have time to cover that in this one, unfortunately, but the release notes should have plenty of stuff to give you the information that you need there. Kenton just dropped a link to them in the chat. Cool. There's a couple of questions here about XCOMs and how they work. Augusto, I can just drop a link to some of our docs on that. I'm not sure what the answer to this is off the top of my head. Kenton, maybe you know. For nested task groups, do you have to use the absolute path for an XCOM, or can you use a relative path for the XCOM?
That's a good question. I think the absolute path, but I'm not totally sure. So just to access the XCOM, I don't think that your XCOMs would change with the task group, because within that task group, you're just grouping things. So you would still need like the task name. So if you've set that up dynamically within the task group so that it's pulling like the group name or something like that, you would, I think, need that whole path, if that makes sense. In some cases, if the task names are static, then I don't think it would matter, because the task group itself it's just a grouping concept. So it's not going to impact kind of the XCOM at all. We do have a guide on task groups though, and it talks about nesting them. So I'm thinking maybe that would be a good place to start with that.
Yeah. Alrighty. The last question is, can you use an Airflow dataset to throw XCOMs to dynamically generate the outlets? That's a hard last question. I don't think it was. Go ahead, Kenton.
Let me just think through that for a second. So can you... I'm not totally sure if I understand what they're asking. So can you use a data set to like you're asking if you can pull like the data set itself that the DAG is scheduled on, like from XCOM?
That's how I interpreted it.
Dynamic? Interesting. That's a good question. I don't think that you can do a DAG schedule that way.
Yeah, I would say that's probably, you want to veer away from trying to do that. And you should think about data sets and XCOMs as two separate things. You don't want to kind of mix the two up there in that sort of way. All righty. Are there any other questions from folks? Kind of a last call here. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for your time. We really do appreciate you jumping on here. Like I said, all of the code that we use, the recordings, as well as the slides will be available to you. We'll send in an email afterwards. And like always, we always want to know what sort of content would be valuable for you all. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have ideas or use cases that you want us to talk about. We'd be really excited about that. Thanks everyone so much for joining.
Thanks, everybody.